and you have no agreement. He's basically saying, I believe that Zelensky and the Europeans can now sit down with Putin and they can work this out. I'm not going to cut a deal and then try and force it down the throats of the Ukrainians and the Europeans.
So John Mearsheimer recently revealed the cold, hard truth about the conference between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Alaska. Why no peace deal resulted as it pertains to Ukraine, and what's holding it up? What would Trump have to do to secure peace here, and why hasn't that happened? So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
What's your reaction so far just to Putin, the way that he handled himself there with Donald Trump, and what does it tell us about the broader situation?
Well, I think that Putin obviously did a brilliant job of handling himself in yesterday's meeting. There's just no question about that. And that's really all he had to do was come and look diplomatic, look smart, look respectful of President Trump. And it would do a great deal to put an end to his isolation in the West and give him real legitimacy. And he came in, and as I think almost everybody expected, he did the job. And he was very effective in that way. And then there's the whole question of the ceasefire, which you raise. Just for the audience's purposes, or for clarification for the audience, it's important to understand that there's a difference between a peace agreement and a ceasefire. And really, what the Russians want is not a ceasefire because they're winning on the battlefield. What they want is a peace agreement. And what the West wants and the Ukrainians want is a ceasefire. And Trump tried to convince Putin that what we need here is a ceasefire. And what resulted is that Putin said there will be no ceasefire. We have to have a peace agreement. And in fact, Trump has now backed off from demanding a ceasefire.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting dynamics here. What he says about Putin, I think, is generally true. You know, no matter what you have to say about Putin, and a lot can be said about him, he's meticulous, deliberate, and consistent about what the terms are that he would want to put a close to this thing, and I think they want to put a close to this thing. You know, history suggests that's true. All the hogwash about how he's about ready to invade Poland is just that, garbage. He offered peace terms in Istanbul to Zelensky, and that was turned down. If you follow this, you know why. Boris Johnson and the U.S. government under Biden shut those conversations down. They said, hey, we have your back, fight on, and they're going to use Ukraine as a proverbial chessboard. And we really have since 2014 when, you know, the U.S. government overthrew that regime, the democratically elected Yanukovych government. So that's true. Russia won't accept a ceasefire, and why should they? They're in the winning driver's seat, having occupied about 90% of the Donbass.
And he said to someone after the meeting that the best solution to this problem is to go directly to a peace agreement. In other words, putting the ceasefire that the Ukrainians and the Europeans and many people in the United States want aside. He's saying that's a non-starter after having talked to Putin. So I think in terms of the clip that you just showed, that's the most important substantive point.
Yeah, I mean, Trump has dropped the idea of a ceasefire, now kind of deferring to an overall peace agreement. That's something that Putin's always wanted, and that's kind of a major change. That's a major shift in the way this is being talked about, because remember, months back, a potential ceasefire was on the table too. You know, that didn't work out, but that has kind of been the U.S. line, you know, despite all the rhetoric Trump had during his campaign about how he would shut down this war in 24 hours. So that's a major change, and you have to give, I guess, some of the victory in terms of who comes away with this better, I guess, to Putin over that part.
And can you unpack for people why Ukraine would be reluctant to reach a peace agreement versus an immediate ceasefire? Like, what is the advantage of one over the other to Ukraine?
Well, the advantages of a ceasefire are mainly that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and the West cannot do much to help it at this point in time. So if you can create a ceasefire, put an end to the fighting on the battlefield. That gives the Ukrainians a respite, number one. And number two, it allows them to get more arms from the West to build up their forces and then put up a better fight against the Russians moving forward once the fighting restarts. In other words, once the ceasefire ends. But the Russians are not Dumkovs, and they understand if they're winning, it would be nuts, to put it bluntly, for them to stop the war when they're winning, allow the Ukrainians to recover, and then fight more effectively at some point down the road.
That's exactly true. I mean, even if it's a 10% chance that, helps Ukraine, we have 10% chance of salvaging the Donbass. The Russians don't want to accept that for all the reasons he just laid out. That is the disadvantage from the Russian perspective to agreeing to a ceasefire relative to agreeing to a peace. Shutting this down forever is what they want. It's what Putin wants, despite all this rhetoric that he's a Hitlerian figure that's trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Again, that's the product of the NATO and U.S. war propaganda machine.
So the Russians have no interest in a ceasefire. Ukraine and the West really like the idea. What the Russians want is they want a peace agreement. They want to settle this one, but they want to settle it on their terms. It's very important to understand this. The Russians view Ukraine joining NATO as an existential threat. This war for them is existential. And they have a set of demands that they will not compromise on. And there are three principal demands. One is that Ukraine and the West recognize that Russia has annexed those 4 oblasts that they now partially occupy, 4 oblasts in Ukraine, plus Crimea. That's demand number one. Demand number two is that Ukraine be a neutral state. That means it can't be in NATO, and there can't be Western security guarantees, especially a security guarantee from the United States. Ukraine, from the Russian perspective, has to be neutral. Third demand is that Ukraine has to disarm, not completely, but disarm to the point where it has no offensive military capability, i.e., it can't threaten Russia. Now, these are 3 harsh demands from the Ukrainian point of view and from the West point of view. These are unacceptable demands to the Ukrainians. And
yeah, that's true, but these have been consistently the Russian desires, and they were supposed to be such under the Minsk Accords when you had the Donbass as a buffer zone. Now, after all this fighting, it seems like the best idea is for Ukraine itself to just be a buffer zone, and the red line was always Ukraine's status in NATO. Go back to the draft treaty and the Istanbul, peace plan on the table to confirm that. This isn't just, us bloviating or whatever, or speaking through the Kremlin. That's the documented evidence that Putin wanted Ukraine's status to be neutral. Demilitarization, denazification, that's something that Mearsheimer didn't mention, but that's been mentioned a lot by Putin. And I actually think relative to those other considerations, the possessions of the territories is actually subordinate to the overall question of Ukraine's status. It can't be in NATO, and the U.S. wouldn't accept that of Canada. If Russia had overthrown the Canadian government and then installed a government that was more adversarial to the United States, then pumped in billions of dollars worth of offensive weapons into Canada or Mexico for that matter, it wouldn't be acceptable here. It's not a mystery why that's not acceptable to Russia.
To most people in the West. And this is why you can't get a peace agreement. So what we have here is the Russians want a peace agreement. The Ukrainians in the West have no interest in a peace agreement. The West and the Ukrainians want a ceasefire, and the Russians have no interest in a ceasefire. Right. And the end result is you have a very short meeting and you have no agreement.
Yeah, and what the best thing would be, America first, the real America first policy, which really would be America only, would just be to disengage, stop the money flowing in. And hey, if Trump wants to negotiate a peace with Putin directly, cut out Zelensky entirely, make this peace agreement based upon the terms that Mearsheimer just laid out, and say, Zelensky, you can take this or leave this. The stipulations are clear. If you do not take this deal, maybe there's minor territorial changes or something slightly to the benefit of Ukraine. So Zelensky can play that off as some kind of win because Russia occupies, again, like 90% of the Donbass. If you don't take that, Zelensky, we're hightailing it out of here. We're gone. Kaput. You have to rely on the mayors and Starmers and Macrons of the world to bail you out now. That would be the real America First policy. The impulses of the military-industrial complex and the neocons, some of which Trump surrounds himself with, Lindsey Graham, Keith Kellogg, etc., are trying to push him against this sort of mentality. But that's what Trump could do if he really wants the U.S. out of this thing.
Given the context, sir, of everything that you've laid out here, that we see that Trump is now dropping the initial ceasefire demand, which effectively, as you said, wouldn't make a lot of battlefield sense for Russia. But on the peace agreement terms, he's accepting this European, or at the very least, the European and the Ukrainians are effectively demanding the same ceasefire that Putin just rejected, as well as a laundry list of other things that are unacceptable to the Russians. So how do you expect then the Monday meeting to go with President Zelensky in the Oval Office?
Well, I think there's one very important dimension to what Trump said that we don't want to lose sight of. And that is, I think he's passing the torch to Zelensky.
Yes.
I think in a very important way, Trump has come to understand that he can't settle this one, right? There's no way he can agree, Trump, to a peace agreement and convince the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Western foreign policy establishment that that's the smart thing to do, right? And he can't convince Putin to agree to a ceasefire. So what can Trump do? And of course, what Zelensky says he should do is put secondary sanctions on Russia. And we can talk about that because this meeting was in good part about secondary sanctions.
Yeah, and it's been completely impotent. The whole sanction regime and secondary tariff discussion has done nothing to change the battlefield conditions. It's just Trump's idle threats that aren't moving anyone in any direction.
And Trump's interest in secondary sanctions in the past. But Trump understands. He was asked afterwards what this means for secondary sanctions. There are going to be no secondary sanctions, at least at this point, says Trump. So the sanctions are off the table. The ceasefire is off the table. And Trump has basically agreed with Putin that you got to go directly. He said this, you got to go directly to a peace agreement. So Zelensky comes to the White House. What does this mean? He's basically saying, I believe that Zelensky and the Europeans can now sit down with Putin and they can work this out. If they need me, I'll be there, but it's up to them. I'm not going to cut a deal and then try and force it down the throats of the Ukrainians and the Europeans because they don't want to go along with me.
And guess what? That mentality is fine if the U.S. weren't bankrolling this thing. If the U.S. wasn't on the hook on this thing, even when the U.S. itself, the national debt, just reached above $37 trillion that U.S. taxpayers are forced to foot the bill over. It's not Trump and his, corporate collaborators that are on the hook for this. It's Americans. And guess what that brings? It brings inflation because the central bank, the Federal Reserve, prints money, which devalues the rest of the money in existence because it increases the money supply. That's inflation. That's what we see when we go to the grocery store and gas stations. So this mentality would be fine. But Trump, you have more leverage than that. You can just hightail it out of there and make Zelensky take it or leave it. That should be the America First solution. So Mearsheimer's right. He's passing the torch and all the power to Zelensky to determine this. And it's very unclear that Zelensky wants this. He has right-wing forces in his own country, Azov, forcing him to oppose Putin to the bitter end, not give up, a meter of ground if he can, and consider Putin's regime illegitimate. But at some point, refusing to acknowledge the regime that is occupying your country is like refusing to acknowledge, the male peer that cheated on your wife. That happened regardless if you want to acknowledge it or not. So that's where we're at right now.
So if you listen to the press conference, this is what you were playing. He said, it's ultimately up to them. He said he's going to call NATO. He's going to call the Ukrainians. But what happens is, and these were his words in the clip that you played, it is ultimately up to them. Very important words.
Yes.
And I think Trump just understands he can't solve this one. And he's correct. He can't solve this one. He might have been able to solve it if he had been strategically smart from the get-go. But since he took office on January 20th up to now, he has behaved in a remarkably foolish and uninformed way in terms of dealing with the Russians.
Well, I agree with just about every word of Mearsheimer there. The only point of disagreement being is I do think he can solve this one. He can solve it through disengagement, the way that you can solve all the military blunders and catastrophes and proxy wars and military operations that have run their course through the last few decades, most of my entire lifetime. You can just disengage, get resources out, get troops out, stop funding these empire building schemes and NATO, which is the European branch of the US war machine, that's for sure. You can disengage. The US has so much more leverage over this thing than Ukraine. And yeah, they're directly involved. Ukraine should have a say ideally. But when it's the US bankroll involved, you have a hell of a lot of leverage in this, Trump. You could end this if you really wanted to. So that's the only part that I would disagree with Mearsheimer. If Trump truly wanted to do this, he could buck the neocons, he could buck the military-industrial complex, and he could simply disengage. He has incredible sway over the Republican-controlled Congress, both the Senate and the House, to whip votes in favor of a disengagement plan. That's all that needs to happen, but there's no evidence he's willing to make that possible. Instead, he's deferring everything to Zelensky. Zelensky is the recipient of U.S. foreign aid. He shouldn't be the decision maker. He could be if the U.S. wasn't involved. Let him to his own sovereignty. Let him control fighting back to the Russians. Let the Europeans help him for all I care. But I sense that this is moving in a bad direction. The war's going to continue. And if anything, Trump will make this a proxy war. And I said proxy twice because right now it's just a one proxy war. Well, if the U.S. disengages over being frustrated about this whole thing, they're just going to sell weapons to the European powers. The European powers are going to give them to Ukraine, and then it's a proxy war. We're still antagonistic to Russia. It's only one more middleman added to the mix, and that's a bad scenario that would prolong this thing. But that's where I think we are. Mostly agree with Mearsheimer here. The key parts were, if NATO or Zelensky signs off on this, I don't think they're signing off on any kind of plan that, of the kind that we talk about here. And I don't know that they can get back much of the Donbass territory, even if they agree to all the other concessions, but I think territorial concerns are less valuable to the Russians than the other things. Ukraine's status, demilitarization, denazification, the ownership of Crimea, etc. But that's where we're at. Let me know down below, do you agree with Mearsheimer on this? Did anything good come from this conference? Do you see a peace agreement? Do you think Zelensky will sign on to this thing? He's going to meet with Trump in the Oval Office on Monday, and I'm not very optimistic, but you tell me in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Breaking Points. Love this conversation. Thank you, Sagar, for hosting it. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can support the channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on my channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.